All right, today we're tackling something huge, a really powerful and, yeah, super controversial movement that just swept through Latin America and shook the Catholic Church to its core. And it all boils down to this one question. Was liberation theology a true gospel for the poor, or was it a dangerous political ideology hiding in plain sight?
At its heart, the idea of liberation is it's central to Christianity, right? I mean, the Vatican itself has said the phrase theology of liberation is a thoroughly valid term because the gospel is a message meant to set people free. That's the whole point.
And that brings us to the central puzzle here. If the basic idea is totally valid, how on earth did one version of it get labeled a fundamental threat to the faith of the Church? That's the mystery we're going to unpack.
Okay, let's get into it. To really get a handle on this whole controversy, you have to go back to the beginning. We need to understand the good intentions, the noble goals, and the very real suffering in 1960s Latin America that started this whole thing.
So this whole movement pops up in Latin America, and it's a direct response to just crippling poverty and brutal political oppression. This wasn't some abstract idea cooked up in a university. No, this was an attempt to make the Christian message of hope mean something real for people who were suffering, right here, right now.
So what did this actually look like? Well, the movement had a few key characteristics. First up, the big emphasis was on earthly liberation, freeing people from unjust systems today, not just, promising heaven later. It also built its theology from below, starting with the actual lived experiences of poor people. Then it brought in this really powerful idea of structural sin, the notion that entire systems, not just individuals, could be sinful. And finally, it didn't pull any punches when it came to criticizing traditional theology, basically saying it had lost touch with the real world.
But this is where things get really complicated. Because in trying to figure out how to analyze and tear down all this oppression, some of these theologians grabbed onto a very specific and very controversial tool. And that decision, it created a huge fork in the road for the entire movement.
And this slide just perfectly captures the core of the whole debate. On one side, you had people saying, hey, Marxism is just a tool. It's a neutral, scientific way to analyze society, kind of like a doctor using an X-ray. But the Vatican fired back, saying, no way, that's impossible. They saw the tool of Marxist analysis as completely inseparable from the ideology behind it, and they called using it illusory and dangerous.
So, what was so dangerous about this path, according to the Vatican? Well, they laid out 4 major dangers, 4 ways they believed this approach was twisting the Christian faith. Let's break them down.
Okay, danger number 1, and this is the big one. The uncritical adoption of Marxist ideology, an ideology the Church saw as just fundamentally incompatible with Christian teaching.
So why was Marxism such a massive red flag? Well, for starters, its core beliefs include atheism and this idea that the individual person is totally secondary to the collective. And you have to remember, for popes like John Paul II, who had actually lived under a totalitarian communist regime, this was just a profound, tragic irony. He's looking over at Latin America and seeing theologians embracing the exact same ideas that had crushed freedom and led to so much oppression back in his home of Eastern Europe.
All right. Danger number 2 was a major shift in focus. The very meaning of words like liberation and salvation started to change, and they became almost entirely about politics.
See, the Church's teaching is that Christian liberation is first and foremost about being freed from the slavery of sin. But with this new thinking, that spiritual goal, it got bumped down to second place. The number 1 goal became earthly, political liberation. And the Vatican saw that as a huge, dangerous watering down of the gospel.
The third danger was about adopting a Marxist lens to view history itself. This is the idea that all of human history is really just one long story of constant class warfare.
And here's why that's so critical. The biblical idea of the poor, the humble, those who have a special place in God's heart, that concept was basically being swapped out for the Marxist idea of the proletariat. So suddenly, the poor weren't people to be served with love and charity, they were a political class, the engine of a violent revolution. A totally different thing.
And finally, danger number 4, and this one was maybe the most destructive. This whole idea of class struggle was turned inward, creating deep, bitter divisions inside the Church itself.
This gave rise to the idea of the Iglesia Popular, or the Church of the People. And what it did was frame the Church as being made up of 2 warring factions. You had the revolutionary Church of the class fighting against the hierarchical Church, which was painted as the oppressor. It basically took a political conflict model and slapped it right onto the body of Christ, threatening to just tear it apart from the inside out.
Okay, so if that's the path the Vatican warned against, what was the alternative? Let's go back to that fork in the road we talked about and look at the path the Church says is the authentic Christian response to injustice.
Now, the Church's answer wasn't to just ignore the poor. Not at all. It was to double down on what it calls the preferential option for the poor. And what's really fascinating here is that the Church actually adopted that phrase from the founder of Liberation Theology himself, Gustavo Gutierrez. But they defined it their way, making the needs of the poor a top priority for Christian charity, and making sure that all social action is rooted in faith, not in a political ideology.
All right, let's put these two paths side by side. This is where the differences become, well, crystal clear.
Yeah, the contrast is pretty stark, isn't it? One path sees class struggle, the other calls for solidarity. One puts political liberation first, the other insists spiritual liberation has to be the foundation. You've got action defining truth versus belief leading to action. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a choice between a worldview built on conflict and one built on love and trying to find the common good for everyone.
So, why should we care about this? Why does a theological fight from decades ago still matter today?
Because this conversation is absolutely still happening. In fact, Pope Francis, who is the first ever pope from Latin America, is often seen as trying to purify the movement. He's trying to save that genuine, heartfelt concern for the poor while making a clean break from the harmful Marxist ideology the Church rejected.
And what's at stake here is, well, it's a lot. We're talking about preserving the core message of the gospel. It's about making sure social action comes from a real change of heart, not just a political playbook. It's a warning against ideologies that have, historically, led to totalitarianism. And, of course, it's about holding the Church together and protecting its core beliefs.
So this whole story really leaves us with a much bigger question, one that goes way beyond theology. When you're faced with an urgent, desperate call for justice and for radical change, how can any group, or even just any one of us, respond in a powerful way without losing the very essence of who we are and what we believe? That's the challenge, and it's something worth thinking about.